it shows the very real dangers of high stress, because I didn't think that something like that could happen to me. I just thought, I just need to push through. I just need to get through this one more shift, this one more day, or just get through this season, as they say, get through this chaotic period. And it's just going to go away. But it doesn't do that. It just compounds. It compounds and it compounds and it compounds.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Burnt Chef Journal, a hospitality-specific podcast dedicated to challenging mental health stigma and conversations designed to inspire a new, healthier, happier, and more sustainable hospitality profession. The Burnt Chef Journal is proudly sponsored by Planday, the workforce management system that helps your business give a shift. From scheduling rotas ahead to tracking time and attendance, managing your team's careers to managing your budgets, Planday has everything you need to make your day work in one easy-to-use platform. Try it yourself with a 30-day free trial only at planday.com. Get your shift together with Planday. Okay, so this week on the Burnt Chef Journal, I am incredibly excited to have a fellow wellbeing advocate in this space. So not only an advocate who talks about mental health and wellbeing, but also runs their own nonprofit as well. Mm-hmm. And has within the last year joined up as a Burnt Chef ambassador as well to help us rally change within the global industry. I am joined by Nio DiPietrantonio. Did I get that right?
Almost. It was close.
Almost.
DiPietrantonio.
Thank you. We practiced 3 times as well before we came on. I still managed to fluff it.
It's a long last name. I get it.
Yeah, over in the UK, Smith is all that we're used to. So that's perfect. And I appreciate your patience whilst I tried that. Thank you. Nio, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing today, Chris?
Good. Very well. Yes. Just returned back from a trip in Atlanta over your neck of the woods.
It looked like it was so much fun. I wish I could have gone.
It was, but don't fear. There will be plenty of other opportunities.
I'm excited.
Yes, it was interesting for me and the team. Well, for me especially, being the only non-North American individual there, to just see the scale of the States and Canada. Geographically, we're probably not used to that in the UK. So I think there'll be a lot more trade shows that we're hoping to appear at, including the NRA, National Restaurant. Is it National Restaurant Association event in Chicago?
Yep, that'll be a good one for sure.
Have you been before?
I went to the American Hotel Lodging Association one before. That was a lot of fun. They were down in Boston. I mean, this was a while ago, back when I was a restaurant manager, and that was a lot of fun. Yeah,
is it worth going?
I think it is. I mean, you get to meet a lot of different people, have a lot of good conversations with different people from different parts of the industry. So like vendors, restaurant owners, bar owners. We get to learn about different trends, which is really exciting. Especially this year, they're talking a lot about non-alcoholic beverages kind of being what the new generations are turning to. So that's really exciting to learn about.
Yeah, I mean, there was a good offering in Atlanta of low and no, but I wouldn't say as extensive as we have over here currently. We've got quite a good selection. And hopefully we'll get up to your neck of the woods, April next year for the Restaurants Canada show, which is perhaps a little bit closer to you.
Oh, that'd be so exciting.
How far is Toronto from where you are in Portland, Maine?
That is a good question. I mean, it's definitely a travel, but I don't think it's like undoable.
Okay, good. So, all right. So there will be opportunities for us to be able to catch up together.
Oh, absolutely.
And spread the word. So, Nio, as with all of my guests, I like to start off with a sort of a brief background, a brief introduction. So how long have you been in hospitality for now?
Going on almost 18 years now. So I started off as actually a hostess for a local chain restaurant. They were kind of known being up and down the East Coast. And when I was 17, my manager asked if I wouldn't mind stepping back to help out on the line because one of our cooks never showed up. So she's like, hey, do you think you can go work the fryer? Because no one's here and we really need someone to do that. And I was like, okay, how hard can it be? So that's kind of how I got started cooking. And I've been cooking ever since. And when I was about 21, I got asked if I would be kind of step into a management role. I had been supervising since I was 18, but I had asked to kind of take over more of a management position. And that's kind of how I got started in like restaurant managing and learning how to be a director. But it was kind of the same thing. Like one of our managers stopped coming to work. So they said, hey, we really need someone who can step up and step in. Is that something you think you can do? And I said, well, all right, I'll give it a try, because it was more money and a little bit more flexibility. So I did that. And after that, unfortunately, I had a very small incident where I kind of had a minor stroke. I had a transient ischemic attack. And that was kind of a combination of both using too much caffeine and kind of the stress of the job. And after that, I decided to go back into cooking again. And from there, I went back into cooking, but at a retirement community, which is what I'm doing now. It's something I'm very passionate about. I like cooking for seniors because I think it's something that is very necessary, but isn't well discussed.
It's not well discussed. I mean, like over here in the UK, I remember back when I identified there was a problem with people either looking to retire from this trade at the age of 28, 30 years old, or they were just looking at a better work-life balance. I was always talking about senior living and retirement homes, and in certain circles, it's got a really bad reputation because it feels like it's not the Michelin glitz and glamour of culinary expertise. But what I don't think people understand is not only do you have a better balance, but the level of intricacy and knowledge that you have to learn about, like the nutritional value of foods and subjects like dysphagia, for example, and understanding that there's 6, 7 different levels of solubility for foods that you have to try and achieve whilst also getting the nutritional benefits and values in order to help residents feel at their best and to be as healthy as possible, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you do have to take into account the nutritional value of the food you're giving them, especially when you're dealing with people who maybe are in assisted living facilities or who are in memory care units. And how do you help people eat who maybe don't remember how to eat or remember what they like? You might be able to put food in front of them, and even if it's something that you know that they enjoy, if they're not eating it, how do you make it more palatable to them? Or if they are unable to chew the food, how do you make that something that you might have to puree? How do you make something like that delicious and palatable to someone who doesn't want to eat? So, I mean, there are a lot of intricacies involved when you're a chef in senior living, and you do have a lot more flexibility. I think there's kind of a misunderstanding about what we do. We do have a lot more flexibility with our recipes, and the residents have a lot of feedback in what they do and don't like. We do have to do culinary committee meetings with residents, and they will let you know in no uncertain terms if they do not like what they're eating. They are very honest about that. But that's a good thing, because then we can tailor what the demands of the menu are. So they do have to hit a certain nutritional value, but we can also tailor it to give them what they want. Especially up here in New England, they prefer more seafood-based food as opposed to places maybe like Texas or Florida, where it might be a little bit more Southern style cooking. It's not the same in every residency home, but you do have to understand what they're asking for so that you can give it to them. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to give the residents what they want, just like at a restaurant.
Well, and considerably more so, because not only is it a restaurant, it's like a hotel it's probably one of the most expensive hotels in the world, right?
Oh, yeah.
These residents are not there, or their families not paying small dollars in order to be able to stay somewhere like that. And there is that level of complexity. And there's something I'm really, so we talk over here at the NACC, which is the National Association of Caretakers and Chefs within those sort of environments. And I'm always very passionate about speaking about that, especially having dealt with modern gastronomy and supplying modern gastronomy products and ingredients.
Yes.
And I've seen some wild things. And, again, I'm going off on a complete random tangent here, but understand that things like, for example, dementia and how the memory doesn't fire, but it can be active. It doesn't fire in the conventional way of someone who doesn't have dementia, but it can be activated by smells and taste.
Especially if they're familiar to them.
Yeah, right. And it snaps back into those happy times. So over here, whilst I was doing some work in a care home over here, the residents like things that smelled like fish and chips, for example, but it was actually using things like maltodextrin to be able to get the flavors of different ingredients. And then you've got your xanthan gums to be able to stabilize stuff. It was mind-blowing. I've never seen anything so intricate in terms
creative.
of design and flavor and taste, right? It's a whole new way of cooking that I don't think people really give it enough credit for.
Absolutely. And you do have to think outside the box sometimes, and you do kind of have to sometimes get the family involved. I mean, we do have a small memory care unit where I work at the moment, and we do one of the things that's a little bit different as opposed to working in a restaurant is that you're very involved in the residents' lives. I mean, where we are, we're expected to share a meal with them at least once a week. We're expected to do activities and events with them once a week, whether that's participating in maybe like doing a yoga class with them or arts and crafts project with them. Like that's expected of everyone in the building. It doesn't matter what your position is. You make time to do it. And there is time, even when you're in the kitchen, to step away and connect with the residents. But that also means connecting with their families as well. So we do connect with the families and the people in the memory care unit, and we can ask them like, hey, what are things that they liked eating when you guys were a family, when you guys would sit down to dinner? What is one of their favorite things to eat? Because we can use that information to encourage their appetites, to get them to eat more nutritional meals, to basically kind of help the cognitive function. Those are things you have to take into consideration, which does require a little bit more nuance and a little bit more innovation than I think people give it credit for.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're long beyond those times where it was pureed, heavily pureed grey foods that we serve. And I think that, yeah, I would urge anyone who's listening to this now, if you think that you've had enough of your environment, work environment, and maybe your perspective is that hospitality is awful, which, we're seeing a resurgence of mindful employers now who care about their team first and their customers second. However, I appreciate that sometimes it can be quite narrow in terms of focus. I urge you to go and look at the care sector, look at senior living, and just try it out, like as a way of exploring new skill sets and getting the balance that you've been looking for these many years, or these years that you've been in hospitality.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there was definitely a culture shock because I was coming from what was considered like fast casual, high volume restaurant where we would do maybe, I mean, for here it was kind of small, but it could be anywhere between like $15,000 to $20,000 in sales a day during the really busy periods to during the wintertime. It might only be like maybe 7,000, 10,000. So going from that to going to an environment in senior living, it's completely different. I mean, you prepare meals throughout the day. You get prepared for maybe a big meal and then smaller meals. But in between that, I mean, you only have so much prep to do. And then you're doing cleaning tasks. And then you're expected to go out and connect with the residents. You don't just get to stay back in the kitchen. You have to do things. You have to go out and talk to them and see them and ask for their opinions and go to culinary meetings. And, you don't have the budget to fall back on necessarily in terms of having sales. You have a very strict budget you have to follow. But within that, you have to also be creative. How can I make this budget work with the food that we're given?
Yeah, credit to you. I think it's a fantastic transition. However, I don't want to gloss over the initial intro that you made about yourself. There's a lot to unpack there. And
oh, yeah.
We'll come on to the health challenges in a second. What I would like to do is just explore the catalysts to getting there, which is not too an unfamiliar story in terms of the person before me in a slightly senior more position hasn't turned up, or perhaps they've become ill, or perhaps they've just left, whether that be suddenly or planned, which then leaves a gap. And that gap is a gap that you stepped into after 3 years as a supervisor and started to cover. How was that transition for you from going from a supervisory role to actually being a manager and lead of a team?
Very abrupt, because I think we can both agree that there's not much in the way of leadership development when it comes to working in restaurants. Not so much these days. I've noticed there's more of an emergence of it. But I mean, this was maybe like 16, 17 years ago when I was just a teenager. I mean, when you're a teenager that's suddenly put in charge of mostly adults, it doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. And unless you have somebody, a strong person in your sphere, like a strong manager to kind of support you and back you up and help develop you personally, it doesn't really work out very well for most people, which is what I found as I kind of developed my own leadership skills. So when I was first an 18-year-old supervisor, I did struggle to enforce rules because I was an 18-year-old teenager telling 30, 40, and 50 somethings what to do. I mean, I can think that most people would struggle with that to begin with. Some people be like, get out of my face, kid. And at that point, it's like you feel like you have no power. It's a title without power. And that's very frustrating, especially in a hectic environment like a culinary place.
Yeah, especially in an environment where I remember my first transitionary role, it wasn't in hospitality. I, similar sort of age to yourself, 18, 19, and found myself as a line manager for a call center and for an insurance company. And I remember the oldest member of the team was about 56. There were a couple of older women there who I managed, and the youngest was probably 17, 18 years old. And these are your peers, right? These are the people
Yes.
that you spent a long time being friendly with, getting to know. And then all of a sudden you're in a position of authority where you have to, you have to not just manage them in terms of getting along with them, but you also have to be the one who orchestrates whatever the business owner or the C-suite exec team are asking you to do. And so how was that transition period for you?
It was a little rough at first. I was very fortunate that our general manager at the time took a really vested interest in me, and she kind of taught me things like what a P&L sheet was, how to get people to actually listen to you when you feel like you don't have any kind of support. So I was lucky to have her to help me with that. But just getting used to that leadership position took some time. It's not something that happens instantaneously, but you have to take into other people's opinions into account in a sense that you have to recognize that they're people first and employees second, like what you were saying earlier. You have to understand that you have to walk the walk and talk the talk to get them to respect you. So if you expect them to do something, you also have to be doing it. So one of the things that we kind of historically struggled with at this chain was what suggestive selling, like getting people to buy appetizers or getting to upsell for a certain side. And we at one point we were actually role playing in the service aisle, like how do we do this, what's a natural way to bring up a suggestive sell. And we had to practice that, and I got comfortable practicing in front of the others so that I could do it in front of the tables when I had to step in and maybe take a table for somebody. And then I would have managers who also worked beside me who didn't prioritize that. So it kind of created this kind of dissonance among the staff where, if one person's not doing it and then another person's doing it, why is that okay? So, having those expectations put down on you and then not having everybody follow them was very frustrating. But also then having a strong leader who would step in and be like, hey, everybody, we're all on the same team. So we all need to work towards the same goals. But kind of overcoming that took some time for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that saying of walk the walk and talk the talk, I think we'll cover later on in our conversation when it comes down to self-care and well-being, because I think whilst you could be the most diligent and attentive service professional when it comes down to serving customers, I think there is a wider gap opening up where we're doing what we can do now to protect our team members, but from a managerial level, actually what we're doing is setting fire to ourselves to keep our team warm. And I know that's something you're very passionate about as well.
It is because, unfortunately, I was one of those people. I had seen how some of our management, how we're treating people. I remember this very specific incident where I was still a line cook at the time. I think I had just turned 18. And we had some kind of like regional directors coming to visit our restaurant. And one of them, they were kind of like helping us run food because it was a busy lunch period. Like they were actually members of the team who would maybe take food to tables, et cetera, et cetera. And we had put up some kind of clam chowder and one of the directors had run it. But the director came back with it because it wasn't hot enough and set it down in the window. And one of the servers was standing next to him. And he had actually dipped his fingers in the bowl and then wiped it on the server and goes, does this feel hot to you? And the server was like my age. She was like 17, 18. And she just looks at him like, what are you doing? He goes, we know better than to run cold food. Like, this is not acceptable. And she wasn't even the one who ran it. He was. So she was so shook, like she didn't know what to do. She went out back and started crying. And he thought that that was perfectly acceptable to treat somebody that way. And just from that one incident alone, that was my catalyst to like never be that kind of manager ever. That kind of defined my whole leadership style where I'm not going to treat people less than or treat them like they're underneath me. So that's really important to remember, that no matter how angry you are or however a customer or a guest might talk to you, don't take that out on other people. That's not their fault. Being a leader means sometimes you have to be a shield for your employees. That's kind of the mantle that you have to accept, and you have to learn how to balance that. And it's not easy.
It's not. I mean, it requires first and foremost emotional intelligence, which and I'm not excusing these behaviors, but I think that when I look back to even myself taking on a team in a sales environment, and it was fast paced, there were hard deadlines. I think human beings this is a wide net that I'm casting here, and I might be wrong in many respects. But from my personal experience, I think from what I've identified is that when human beings are put under a tremendous amount of stress with tight deadlines, where their time feels like, I often refer to stress to find out how stressed you are, find out what your time's doing. If your time scale is flying and you don't have enough time in the day, everything feels like it's starting to compound, chances are you're in high levels of stress. The default is to rule by aggression and quick fixes. How am I going to get people to be fearful and scared to get them to do what I want quickly, which is kind of like it's kind of like an adolescent childlike behavior, isn't it, really, when it comes down to working environments?
Absolutely. And I mean, it kind of feels like almost that's what's expected in hospitality in certain positions where, this is how I was taught, so this is how we're going to teach other people. Because I kind of experienced that attitude in different levels of the kitchen. I mean, I used to work with a head chef who thought it was perfectly acceptable to throw things when he was upset or when he was angry. And it wasn't necessarily that he was throwing things at people, but if you just happened to be in the way, you were going to get hit with an oven mitt or a utensil or something. And, it can only happen so many times before people get pissed off and leave, or you get hit with something in the head. You know what I mean? And then it's a danger issue. Then it's a potential lawsuit issue. And we need to get out of this mindset that it's okay to not be emotionally regulated, even when we're under stress. We need to come up with coping mechanisms. We need to have ways to de-stress when we are at our most stressed out, especially under high pressure industries, like when you're behind the line or when you're in the middle of a busy restaurant or taking care of guests. You can't have temper tantrums like that and expect people, one, to respect you, or to have guests look at you and say, why is this acceptable? If you're not going to treat guests that way, please don't treat your employees that way.
Yeah, I mean, completely right. In your experience then, I mean, I've been following you for a while. Your content on LinkedIn, and if people aren't following Nio on LinkedIn, please do, is insightful and professional and well-grounded. And I respect it a lot. From one professional to another, I really do respect it. What is it then, from a slightly more in-depth question, what is it that you think is holding individuals back from having that emotional regulation, having that ability to be able to keep that professionalism within that work context?
I think a lot of it might just be from a lack of education. They don't know how to do it. Mental health really is not well discussed. I mean, even nowadays, when it's kind of more of a resurgence of mental health and things like meditation and talking about counseling or psychiatry or self-care, things like that, it's really kind of more new that people are talking about it and discussing it. And in a professional setting, it's definitely not discussed around over here, especially in my area. I mean, if we were to have a webinar or a discussion or a workshop about emotional regulation in the workplace, I think a lot of people would probably raise their eyebrows and go, why? And it should be discussed. It needs to be discussed. We need to understand what happens to us when we're under stress and why we react the way we do. And to do that, you do kind of have to sit with yourself and go, okay, what are my triggers? Why am I acting this way? And how do I react the way that I want to react? And sometimes that might mean sitting down with a counselor, or sometimes that might mean just sitting down with yourself and asking some really tough questions and writing some stuff down. Why do I react the way I do when I'm stressed out? Why do I treat people the way I do when I'm stressed out? And what's the difference between being stressed out and being not stressed out? How do I find that sweet spot? And how do I treat people the way I want to treat them, whether they're a guest or whether they're an employee?
That's, yeah, so true. That's hard, right? That's uncomfortable for people to do, to sit. I mean, even meditation, I think when you has its benefits, massive benefits.
But it can be hard to do. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when in a culture like, a lot of us tie our worth to our productivity. If we don't think that we're actively doing something, then we feel like we're wasting time. I still work with chefs now that even think that taking a break is a waste of time. And for a while, I was one of those people. I'm like, well, I have prep to do. I have baking projects to do. I have cakes to frost and dough to knead and stuff like that. But you do have to make time to rest. You can't constantly be going. And coming to the realization that your worth is not tied to your productivity is really important. And that needs to be fostered, not just on a personal level, but on a professional level too. You don't always have to be on and going to be worth something as a person or as an employee.
No, and that's so true. And I think it starts from the ground up. I mean, I remember my training days within bars, and it was like time to lean, time to clean.
Oh yeah.
And like you couldn't have a chat with a customer. You couldn't grab a cup of water. You had to brass the draft pumps, and you had to wipe the bars down. And
But that's what keeps them coming back. They want to talk to you. You need to make time to connect with your guests and your customers.
It's so frustrating. And I think also what I've acknowledged over the last 6 years is we work at such a frantic pace that having that time to sit down or having that time to break feels deeply uncomfortable. We're not conditioned, right? It doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, and please don't misconstrue my words, so whoever's listening to this, but it means that we're conditioned into running a race that we can't win.
I agree.
And that doesn't mean that it's not right that you take that time off, and it doesn't mean that it's right to keep running towards destruction, ultimately, both physical and mental, as well as operational destruction.
It might come from kind of a personal place too, where you might have to sit with yourself and go, why does stillness bother me? Why do I feel this way? And that can be a very hard introspective question to ask yourself, whether you're an employee or just dealing with it as a person. Because I know people personally who just fill their free time with tons of projects to keep themselves busy. If you don't give yourself time to rest, eventually your body is going to shut down. You're going to hit a wall somewhere. It's going to happen. And you don't want it to be catastrophic to the point that you can't come back. You're going to have a limit, but you also have to recognize what your limits are and how to better prepare yourself and take care of yourself so that you can keep going and doing the things you want to do.
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't mean that an individual is weak if they're taking time off, right? We all have our different thresholds. And also, I'm going to say it's not fucking sustainable to run yourself into the ground like a machine. Like, we've been taught that stiff upper lip, that man up culture of if you're feeling ill, if you're feeling tired, pull your socks up and get on with it. And I will say there is a place for that. I think that you do have to build resilience through some hard times.
Absolutely.
But not if that's every single day of your existence. And you're right, it's that education piece about how do we get people to understand that self-care is not just good for you, it's good for the team, it's good for your family, it's good for longevity, it's good for mental health, and steering away from things like depression and substance use to be able to perform well. It is hard. And I, for one, I'm very open about this. I struggled with solitude. And I thought, I did emotional intelligence training, and I thought to myself, I don't struggle with solitude. I work alone every single day. And she was like, yeah, but do you stop at all? And I'm like, yeah, I'll take the dog for a walk, or I'll sit in the bath. And she's like, yes, but do you actually just stop, or do you always have distractions? And I was like, all right, come to think of it, I'm always listening to podcasts. I'm always listening to music. I'm always doing something that's activating my brain and allowing it to concentrate on something. She goes, that's solitude. And she says, you struggle with that. And I went, bloody hell. And it takes some time to get used to that quietness.
I agree. Absolutely. And I think it kind of stems a little bit from maybe a little bit of ego, a little bit in a way, and that we tie our productivity and our ability to stay busy with success. We think that we're successful, or we're going to be successful, because we push ourselves, because we're always staying engaged, or because we're always striving to better ourselves in some way or some fashion. But you have to learn that even though you might want to do these things to be successful, that, again, what you were saying is that how do you have sustainable success? You can't be successful and drive yourself into the ground. You can't be successful and put yourself into a coma, or drive yourself into an addiction, an alcohol addiction, or a substance use addiction. Those things aren't sustainable, because eventually, again, your body's going to shut down. So how do you define success, first of all, as an individual and as a professional? And how do you achieve that success in a sustainable way? And you do kind of have to put your ego aside to learn how to do it the right way. You might think that the way that you have is the best, but there's always something to learn from somebody else. So you do kind of have to step away and say, okay, I do have this body of knowledge, but how do I expand on it? You have to be open to learning something new. And that can be very challenging for sometimes people in the culinary profession, because we do, people go to culinary school, or they might have a ton of knowledge in the industry. And then they get to a point where they might feel like they know all there is to know, or they're not willing to listen to maybe, a younger chef who has new ideas, or a new method of doing something, or a new business owner who has a new idea. And that can be very detrimental to the idea of success. Because if you're not willing to grow and learn, how do you become more successful?
Mm. Yeah, so true. So true. I think the biggest, someone asked me, who was the chap's name when I was in Atlanta? He asked me a completely left field question. He said, what's the greatest thing you've learned about yourself since starting the project? And I said, when I started the project, I used to say yes. And I still do say yes a lot. Every conversation, no matter how grand it is on the scale of development from the business, or if it's just a general conversation, I'll say yes. And the reason why I say that is I always learn something, whether it's about myself, whether it's about another subject. And since doing that, it opens you up to the infinite possibilities that firstly, I don't know everything.
Which
And that's
can be hard
okay.
for people to admit.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, Christ, without ambassadors like yourself and the 250 volunteers we've got globally, or the team I have, we wouldn't be where we are now if it was just me fumbling along, banging a drum in a room in the UK, right? So you don't know everything. That's okay. You're going to make mistakes. That's okay. And there are also people out there who do things better than you. And that's also really cool. That's really great as well. And I guess it comes on to my sort of next question, which is, during your career and sort of either before or after your illness, was there a period where you had to start delegating more and trusting other people with skill sets greater or even comparable to your own? And how did that feel
Yeah,
for you?
absolutely. So there was a period kind of like right before I had my health struggles where I was running a restaurant where I was kind of acting as both the general manager and the director for a region, where I was working with other chain restaurants in the area, and I was kind of trying to help run them as well. So running one restaurant is very stressful. Running a couple of different restaurants from different chains is very stressful. I was working at the time probably upwards of 18-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. When I was home, I was answering emails, I was checking my phone, I was talking to vendors and suppliers, I was talking to employees who were stressed out, and I was trying to take on so many things at once because I cared about all of the employees everywhere. I didn't want them to feel stressed out and burnt out because other people were also working crazy hours like I was. They were working behind the lines, they were working on the counters, they were out in front of the guests, they were putting in all these crazy hours because this was kind of coming out of the pandemic where we just didn't have the people to supply the labor shortage that we were experiencing. And it was so incredibly stressful that I didn't feel like anybody else should shoulder that burden. I had like this weird sense of guilt about it. And it was so unsustainable, but I kept pushing myself and trying and trying. And coming out of that mindset where I felt like I had to shoulder all that responsibility, all of that guilt, all of that burden was very difficult. But I actually did see a therapist about it for a while because at the time I was also kind of going through divorce as well. And she told me that obviously it's not sustainable, but to stop tying my self-worth into, again, my productivity, which is kind of what started me on that whole path of how do I define myself as a person? What does my own self-worth actually entail? What does that mean to me? And why do I feel like I can't trust other people to help me run these tasks? So I did have a meeting with other managers and I said, look, guys, obviously this isn't going well. I'm struggling. I don't know if we can keep going this way. And I said, what can we do to support each other right now? And some of them did take some stuff off my plate. Some of them took things like scheduling off my plate. Some of them took things like truck orders off my plate. Some of them took things like inventory off my plate. And even just releasing that stranglehold just a little bit took some of the weight off my shoulders because I didn't have to carry all that burden. I had to learn how to trust people. And that lack of trust came from different sources. It came to things outside of my life and inside of my life. I was going through a divorce at the time. I was struggling with trying to, keep too many balls up in the air, taking care of my family. And you have to learn somewhere to either let one of the balls go, let one of them hit the floor, or they're all going to hit the floor. So you do have to learn how to trust your team to help you or teach them how to help you.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it comes with its challenges, knowing that the way that something is going to perform done by someone else is not going to be the same way that you will do the job, or this perfect
Right.
paradigm in your head. I remember meeting a chef a few years ago at an event, and he said, I'm fed up with my team. I said, why? He said, they don't do anything. I said, well, what are you doing to change that? Why don't you give them more responsibility? He was like, I can't do that. They'll only make mistakes and mess it up. I'm the only one who can do that. I was like,
I hate that
okay, how's
mindset.
that working out for you? And he's like, well, I've got 8 days on now. I'm doing probably the best part of 80 to 100 hours during those 8 days. And I was like, is that sustainable? He goes, well, there's no other way. And I tried to speak to him about it, but I think he wasn't open to collaborative approach.
The my way or the highway mentality.
Yeah, it is. And it's such a shame as well, because if you were to empower the team, but again, I think that comes down to the time, it comes down to stress. I think it should also be noted that biologically, if you experience chronic stress for long periods of time, your response in terms of dampening those stress responses starts to dissipate. So it makes it harder and harder to cope with stress and to come down from those adrenaline highs. So, there's a whole, it's not just psychology, but it is also biology of these chronic stress environments. And that kind of brings me on to your situation. I mean, I've told a story previously whereby someone has actually lost sight due to burnout, and they went temporarily blind for a period of time. People don't believe that. They're like, nah, there's no way that stress can actually make you ill. And yeah, it might increase your heart rate, etc. But again, we have another story here, a real life example of when undue pressure and trying to run too fast to keep up with the pace has actually caused health issues. What did that look like for you?
Oh gosh. So it was, again, I was working those crazy hours, but I was also abusing caffeine at the time. I was taking caffeine pills and I was drinking probably upwards of 3 to 4 energy drinks a day. It was just to get through those long days, those shifts, because I was on top of the management duties. I was also inside the restaurants. I was cooking. I was helping fill in gaps when there were no servers around. Sometimes I would stay late to help if there was no host available. It was just doing anything I could to make sure that the restaurant was successful. And it was one particular night when it was just so crazy busy. I was trying to get inventory done early so that I could hopefully go home and get some sleep. And at the time, I didn't know it, but I was having a transient ischemic attack, which is basically a small stroke. And what happened was I had lost my vision a little bit, where everything I looked at looked like a pixelated image. And I didn't know what was going on. I just thought it was like a really bad headache because I had some temple pain. And I told one of my servers, I'm like, I feel like shit. I don't know what's going on. And she's like, well, what's going on? And I told her. And she's like, well, why don't you maybe just go put your head down in the office for a few minutes or something? So I did. I went out back and I kind of just put my head down and slept on the desk or tried to sleep on the desk for maybe like an hour. And it didn't go away. So she came in and she's like, how do you feel? And I said, I still feel like shit. I don't know what's going on. So she ended up calling 911. And I did have an ambulance come and check me out. And they took me to the hospital, where they told me, hey, you are struggling with an ischemic attack. And eventually it did stop. My vision came back. And it was very scary. And I said, well, what's happening? And they said, it sounds like what's going on is that you're under a lot of stress. And the caffeine did not help, but kind of exacerbated the issue. And I did have to see a neurologist for a while after that. I still do see a neurologist periodically because it does put me in kind of a high risk category now, unfortunately. But it shows the very real dangers of high stress, because I didn't think that something like that could happen to me. I just thought, I just need to push through. I just need to get through this one more shift, this one more day, or just get through this season, as they say, get through this chaotic period. And it's just going to go away. But it doesn't do that. It just compounds. It compounds and it compounds and it compounds. And I thought at the time that I was just like a perfectly normal, healthy person, until you realize that it's not. I was justifying it by saying, well, it's not drugs, it's not heroin, it's not cocaine, like et cetera, et cetera. But it was still very unhealthy. And I would consider it an addiction, because if I didn't take the caffeine pills, or if I didn't have the energy drinks, I would get a massive headache and I wouldn't be able to work. So I get it. I understand how this can happen to everybody. So it is a real issue that can happen to anybody. And if you don't take it seriously, eventually your body's going to, put the brakes on.
Yeah, it doesn't give you a choice, does it? And it happens quite suddenly as well in many cases.
Yes. I mean, this was in the middle of a dinner shift. I mean, I'm glad I was around other people at the time when it happened. So at least somebody was there to check on me. But, at the same time, it was also the environment I was in that kind of caused it. although a little bit was it also me not really taking care of myself. Like, I can't just blame the industry for that. That is also me perpetuating the idea that we have to struggle to be successful. So, I mean, I do play a part in that as well.
If you're enjoying this week's episode, consider heading over to our website and supporting our ongoing work in destigmatizing mental illness and creating a healthier, happier, and more sustainable industry by purchasing some of our branded merchandise. We have a whole range of t-shirts, hoodies, chef's jackets, well-being journals, plus a whole host more available on worldwide dispatch. All funds raised from sales of these items go towards free-to-access e-learning content, as well as providing free support systems and help for those who may be experiencing difficulty with their mental health. And I think that it is a two-sided coin. I mean, obviously we work with organizations and we work with individuals, and the organizations are going, well, we already do enough. It's the individuals that need to look after themselves, and individuals are going, well, I already do look after my own self-care, but my environment is not conducive to health and well-being. And I think it's a 50-50 split. Like we need to be responsible for our own health and well-being as human beings, and to make sure that we are able to perform, but then owners also have to take a proactive approach to make sure the environments are safe in the first place. You wouldn't walk into a burning building and start serving burgers, would you? Like, it's
well, that's exactly it too. I mean, I want to say it was around 2021 when I was seriously considering leaving the industry. And I'm glad I didn't. But at the time, I was just like, this is so unhealthy. There's no way that I can keep doing this. I'm miserable. Like, I would come home and just cry. I would cry myself to sleep because I was thinking about all the stressful things I had to do the next day. Like, what am I going to do if somebody doesn't come in? How am I going to cover this shift? How am I going to have to work like a triple shift sometime just to cover all the people who don't show up? Because everybody else was feeling the pressure of not having anybody. And it was actually around that time that I heard you were on a podcast talking about how we shouldn't have to struggle or change who we are just to survive in an industry that isn't necessarily healthy, and that the industry should change to kind of help us. And that was like how I discovered the Burn Chef Project even existed. And I'm like, wow, that is so impactful. How do we do that? How do we change the industry? Because that had never been proposed to me before. It's always like, well, if you don't like it, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Everybody's heard that. And I've never even heard it put that is something that we can change. As silly as that sounds, like, it never even occurred to me. It doesn't occur to most people even now that it's something that we can change. So that's kind of how I started following the Burnt Chef Project back in 2021, kind of after the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic, kind of towards the end of it. And that's when I think more hospitality workers and more people in the culinary field started saying, this lifestyle is not sustainable. And they started leaving the industry, which is very detrimental, especially kind of up here in the Northeast, where the hospitality industry is a huge industry that employs a lot of people. We're struggling to fill roles even now, especially during kind of one of our busy winter seasons, which is a huge tourist season for us. We need to get more people interested in working in the industry, but to do that, we have to make it healthier and more sustainable.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that experience. And I'm sorry that also happened. And I'm sorry that it got to that stage. And I think most of the people listening to this, including myself included, we've felt like rock stars until we end up hitting rock bottom. And that blame doesn't necessarily always rest with working environments. There is, as I say, that self-care element. But the long journey of actually trying to create a profession that we're proud of, that we want to promote to our children, has begun, and it's rapidly growing pace. And, who would have thought that post-pandemic we'd be sat here talking from different sides of the pond about exactly the same subject matter and exactly the same ethos. Change is happening. It's difficult to see at times, but it's getting there. So what stopped you then from becoming one of the statistics of an individual leaving the industry going, it's harmed me, I'm hurt, I'm out, to taking this longer term view of, okay, how can we collaboratively change this profession into something that we can be proud of and that's sustainable and that allows business operators to have healthy businesses as well as individuals to have healthy lives? What was that pivotal moment for you?
A lot of it was kind of it was like things that kind of happened like one after another. So it was the restaurant chain that I was working at the time, they got bought out by a private franchisee. And unfortunately, when that happened, we no longer had health insurance coverage. So that was a big red flag because unfortunately I do have to take medications because of what happened, and they're kind of expensive. So without health insurance, they're not really affordable. So when that happened, I did have to start looking for work that had health insurance coverage. And at the time, my friend who worked in senior living was like, hey, we're looking for a chef. If you're interested, I can have you come in and talk to my boss. And their boss was like, heck yeah, come in, let's have an interview. So that's how that kind of got started in the senior living community, which showed me that you can do things like cooking, which is a passion of mine. I love to cook. And you can do these things and have a healthy lifestyle. There is balance out there if this is what you want. And from that, especially after the pandemic, we had kind of, between me and some of the employees at the chains that we worked at, we had kind of like a little text-based support group. And what that means is that if one of us was struggling with something, the others would try to help them with finding resources for that. So one of them was that we had a server in our group who was having trouble finding resources for their special needs children. Both of them are young, but they're autistic. And during the pandemic, there really was no access to resources for anything, for schooling, for education, because everything was shut down. They were still trying to reopen things. Everything was social distancing. So we actually found a couple of resources local, like the Autism Society of Maine, who was willing to help that individual find resources to help with the kids. And she was really grateful for that. And then another one of our support group members who was very young, they were a teenager. They were battling a heroin addiction at the time, unfortunately. And in their area, they were trying to find a recovery center that was still open, that wasn't, struggling with trying to remain open during the pandemic, which is very difficult for a lot of businesses. So from that, a couple of us in the group, a couple of managers decided that we wanted to make that bigger. We wanted to try to create an actual support group for hospitality workers, because that thing doesn't really exist. Like for people who are struggling with food insecurity, what food pantries are in their area? If you're trying to find a recovery center, if you're going through a substance use disorder, what recovery centers are in your area? So that kind of started the idea for the nonprofit that we started up here, which I was inspired to do by the Burnt Chef Project. We decided to make it an official nonprofit organization, which is incredibly stressful by itself. So I understand the struggle with that. But I'm glad that we did it, because a lot of people are interested in the idea of collecting resources and providing them to hospitality workers.
Well done you. That's a lot of work. And it's also,
it is.
We talk about self-care and trying to maintain a career and a profession whilst also giving back to others. That's a big step to take.
It's a lot of balls in the air, especially because I found when you start off as a founder, there really is no such thing as work-life balance. Get so many things off the ground. You've got deadlines you have to meet, you have paperwork you have to file, and I'm not sure what the process is like in the UK, but in the US, it's so complicated. It's like, if you didn't check the right box, you got to resubmit your paperwork, and then you got to have somebody look it over, and then submit it to this body and submit it to that body. And I imagine it's probably similar over there. But just getting through that alone, and then trying to find ways to fund it and finding volunteers to help you with it. We were very lucky because a lot of our people in our support group are willing to help us. We have a lot of people looking for resources in their area. And just that alone means that people are interested in helping and that there's a need for what we're doing.
Yeah, and where there's a need, there's also, it's kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? The more that something's needed, the more people access it, which then pushes up the issues with having to actually afford it in the first place.
Absolutely. And then obviously that puts a little bit more pressure on the leaders of the group to work a little bit harder and put in a little bit more effort. And then I'm pulling back from the lessons that I learned during my restaurant manager days, that you do need to make time to take care of yourself, or you're just going to crash and burn like you did before. So you do need to make time for self-care and pulling back, making strategic retreats. That's what I call them. You do have to take a step back, breathe, focus, relax, and then you can think clearly. What's my next move? What's the next right move for us?
Yeah. And that's such wise words as well. Again, even I'm guilty of sometimes if we get really busy periods or we get a sudden change in contract or something like that, it suddenly takes a position that was, okay, we're ticking along quite nicely now to fuck.
Yes. You kind of have to strike with the iron's hot, especially in the nonprofit world, because you don't have the funds coming in like a normal business does. And a lot of it is based off relationships that you create with other organizations or other people. A lot of the resources that we collect up here are just from introductions I've made to other people. Hey, I know this guy who works in this nonprofit or runs this nonprofit. And turns out a lot of them started in hospitality.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I guess there's a certain element of care, right? Whether it's senior living or whether you're working in a hotel, whatever it might be. Like, we care about people, whether.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that what we do is born from the fact that we like to take care of people. We like to serve meals to people. We like to help people. We like to enjoy doing special events with people. I mean, for a while I was doing catering events, and I thought that was so much fun. I love doing the intricacies of decorating and doing fancy plate displays and food art. I mean, all of that stuff is super fun. And when you get to see other people enjoying what you do or feeling comforted or taken care of, that's very rewarding. I think that's what hospitality is all about. And people get into hospitality because they want to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And it means to segue into non-profit work and to NGOs. 501c is kind of a natural progression. But I think what I've identified and where I try and help out as possible, obviously I'm a board member for Chow over in Colorado, who are
Love
a fantastic organization.
Yes.
And Jasmine, I met in Atlanta, actually, which was quite surreal. Is actually, how do we help people how do I personally, using my experience, help people who have transitioned into the not-for-profit sector, make them commercially viable? Because it's one thing leading a team or serving or, plating up like an absolute master, but you've never necessarily run a business or you've never generated revenue. And that can be quite a challenging thing. You've got a good heart. You want to do things to help people, but actually, how do you do that? How do you get to that without the experience? And so that's where I try and, with my background, I try and help other NGOs now, as well as keeping the Burnt Chef project afloat. But in terms of the scale and the impact of the nonprofit that you run, what are some of the highlights for you over the last, how long has it been going for now?
We're almost at our year mark in June. We'll be operating at a year as quickly as it went by. And I mean, just even having people interested in the first place felt very frightening, because the nature of hospitality work is to kind of be in the background, is to operate in the background, is to be seen and not heard, as that the guest always comes first, and all of that comes with that. They come first. We're just supposed to be seen and not heard in the background, right? So to actually come forward and say, we're struggling, is a huge step for people, especially for people like chefs who aren't maybe the most social sometimes and don't like to talk about their feelings. I mean, if you had asked me at 21 how I was feeling as a chef, like if I needed to talk about my feelings, I would have probably thrown a dish rag in your face. Like, that's just the nature of it, how it has been. But now having conversations with people in a professional setting, like we go to trade shows around here and talk about it. We talk about the Burnt Chef Project as a resource. We talk about Chow as a resource, because that is absolutely essential. I think it should be like personal protective equipment for people in hospitality. That should be up in everybody's break room, because those meetings are so pivotal to have a space to just talk about your feelings in your life in hospitality. But having connections with other organizations that are willing to help us grow is very huge. There's a lot of people who want to partner with us, especially like recovery centers. Food pantries are willing to partner with us to kind of help their industry people who are struggling, because unfortunately food insecurity is very big among hospitality workers in our area. Just having people willing to take a vested interest in it, I consider a huge accomplishment.
Well, it is a huge accomplishment. I mean, it shows clearly there's a need. There's a massive need. And I think it's conversations like this that you and I are having, and the content that we both put out, that really highlights it. And I don't think that no amount of social posts and no amount of stats and numbers and figures really gets people, until you do the work that we do in a nonprofit space, you never really, you cannot comprehend the scale and the enormity of people in need.
Well, like, we see it in our kitchens, and we see it in our hotels, and we see it in the places that we work. I mean, even just looking up from my prep table, there were times when, unfortunately, there were some people who used to come to work drunk. Very recently, in one of the places I worked, we had a dishwasher who was unfortunately drinking on the job and got let go. And I understand the necessity of doing that. But at the same time, I'm like, I wish that we had sat down with him and said, look, what are you going through? What can we do to help you overcome this challenge? Obviously, not having them work there, I understand, because it's a violation. It's a safety hazard. But can we set this person up on a road to success where this doesn't happen again? to get them into like a recovery center or in a detox clinic, or even just give them access to that information to destigmatize the fact that, you know, a lot of people do struggle with alcohol dependency or substance use in our industry. We see that all the time, people coming into work hungover or maybe even slightly drunk from the night before. We do unfortunately see people using cocaine at work in bars because they're trying to stay awake for their long shifts, or maybe they're just, you know, caught up in the culture of that you have to do this to have a good time, or that you have to do this because it's expected. I see people struggling with food insecurity in our industry. I remember working in kitchens where people couldn't afford food, so they would be sneaking food out of the freezer and the refrigerator to take home to their families. We see it on a small scale, and then when you actually start working in the nonprofit sector, you realize it's a lot bigger problem than you thought it was.
It's so underreported, and I think that even with the reporting, I mean, we've done a number of studies now with universities, with other profits. We did one over in the UK on suicide within hospitality. We're doing one on imposter syndrome, on Gen Zs and their attitudes to working in hospitality. And you start to get like 2, 3, 4, 5,000 respondents, and the numbers are so huge, but still, that's not even 1% of the total global hospitality community. And that doesn't include the extended ecosystem, right? There's those suppliers who are running as fast as they can to keep up with the demands of workers within the industry, plus also the economical challenge as well. It's just well done. And if I can be of any support to you or the team, then let me know. Even if it's just someone to bounce ideas off, then please do let me know, and I'm happy to do that.
I'm so grateful. Even just, I listened to you at a time when I literally thought that I would not be able to make it in this industry. And I was very sad about that. I was sad because I love doing what I do. I love to cook. I've been cooking with my Nonna since I was like 3 years old. She was a very kind of like tough Italian lady who was like, if you're old enough to stand, you're old enough to cut. So she started teaching me how to cut things when I was like 3 years old. She gave me a little tiny chef knife, like it was like, you know, this big. And she taught me how to start cooking. And my Nana from my mother's side was also very involved in kitchen life and cooking and baking. Like the two of them molded me into a chef. That is so ingrained in who I am. And to not be able to do that professionally, I felt like would have ended me in a way. I would have just been so miserable. Like I would just keep coming back to wanting to cook. And I don't want to keep perpetuating the idea that the industry is just so toxic and dangerous for people, because it might be now, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to keep being that way. We can make it better, especially for the upcoming generations like Gen Z. I have Gen Z coworkers who are amazing, but even now they're still talking about I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. And I get it, but I don't want them to feel that way, because they can go in so many different directions in hospitality. They just need to see what that looks like, and we have to make it a healthier way to get there.
For sure. Like, and also, you know, some of the greatest roles in the world are the customer facing or the creative roles. But actually, when it comes down to other roles within hospitality, even within a single business, you're going to have a HR professional. You're going to have someone who maybe a well-being officer, an accountant, a marketing design team, or even just a single person who takes photos. You know, I think that, and whilst it'd be a shame, I understand the pressures of the sector. I'm fighting, and you and I are fighting so hard to try and keep people within the roles that they signed up for, and to make sure that those roles are sustainable for them, so they get grey hair, old hair, and they can actually retire at a decent age without any health complications that have been brought on by a challenging industry. But if you have had enough, before you think about leaving a different sector, there are a wealth of additional options out there. I mean, just being at NAFM and just seeing the number of dealers and reps and manufacturers, I mean, Christ, a lot of these guys are a lot of ex-chefs, a lot of ex-service professionals as well, who have managed to keep their finger on the pulse, and who are now working with organizations like ours to be able to create change so that their customers, their clients, their friends within the industry aren't impacted by the type of style of working that it is. The question I get asked a lot, and I'm going to ask you now, is how is change even possible? How long is it going to take to see meaningful change within a sector that is so big and has run historically the same way for so many years?
I don't think it's impossible. I think we're seeing change now. I mean, I remember when I was very, very young, well, not super young, like when I was a young supervisor, they had us watch this video called The Lone Dancer. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a small leadership video about a guy at it's like a concert. I think it was like Woodstock or something like that. And they show him and he's getting up and he's kind of doing like this crazy little dance at this, this big event. And he looks a little silly. He's up there dancing, having a good time. And then slowly a couple people start dancing with him. And eventually it gets to the point in the video where everyone around him is dancing and they're just going crazy and having a wild good time. And that the point of the video is that to even get to that point, you kind of have to be the lone crazy dancer. And I think that's what we need more of. We unfortunately kind of have to put ourselves out in front of the spotlight and be the crazy dancer to get people to come up and dance with us. We have to be willing to have these tough conversations and say, I struggled with this. I love what I do, but I've struggled. I've struggled mentally. I've struggled emotionally. I've struggled physically. And I don't want to stop doing what I'm doing, but we need to address the root causes of the problem so that we can have more people keep doing what we're doing. So we do have to keep having these conversations, and I think it's going to keep making change. We already have people lining up behind us dancing. We just have to keep dancing.
So great. That's so great. And this is why, so we opened up our ambassador scheme.
I saw that. Yay!
For new applications for March, and then we'll do it again in October. And I sent across a screenshot of my team to the post, and I said, this is the best post we've made all year. And the reason why it's the best post is that every single ambassador we have in our books pushes this conversation further down the road. And I feel proud and inspired to hear you talk and to hear your views. And the project and your NGO and your nonprofit you are a great asset. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate even just hearing you. I mean, I follow you. I've been following you since I listened to that podcast. It makes a difference. The things you say make a difference. So please don't stop talking. Please don't stop being that crazy dancer, because I'll keep dancing with you.
Well, thank you. I need all the help I can get, and I definitely won't stop talking, as my team, if they're listening to this, will attest to. So, practical tips then. So, obviously, you've had quite a severe health scare. You are in a position now where you've managed to obtain some semblance of work-life balance in a career that you enjoy, as well as frees you up time to start up with your impactful work that you're doing outside of that as well. What do you do in terms of managing your time and energy resources? How do you look after yourself? And what things have you learned over the last few years?
I definitely credit going through that brief bit of therapy. I would suggest even just talking to a counselor, if you get the opportunity to do it, makes a huge bit of difference, because I needed to see why I was having trouble with stillness. And it was because I kept tying my worth as a person to my productivity. And I needed to learn how to be still and to just exist in a space without tying it to being productive, to doing something. And once I learned how to do that, I learned how to channel that energy into things that actually brought me a sense of peace. So I have an art degree. I actually went to art school when I was younger. I started painting again. But when I was working those crazy hours, I never thought that I could take care of a pet. And I've always loved animals. So I adopted a couple of animals. I have a cat and I have a parrot. And having them around is so good. I love talking to them and playing with them. I mean, that's just even having that is a form of self-care. You have to find what makes you tick as a person. But to do that, you have to do the work. You have to do the work emotionally and spiritually and physically. And I recommend taking the time to talk to a counselor. Even if you think you don't have the time, you got to make the time. You got to do the work.
Yeah, for sure. And for anyone interested, we do have our global counselling service that's available in 29 languages across the globe. It's our first year of running that. We come up to the end of our first year this month. And I think that service in itself has helped approximately 400 people. Not all of them are in the UK, like a vast majority, but we're seeing utilization rates from Australia, Canada, and America, and even Dubai as well. So use that service. We'll be updating our website with a new upgraded service very, very shortly as well, which offers even more support. So come the end of March, that'll be there. But in the meantime, we list a lot of resources on our website, similarly to you guys, that give international support mechanisms, listing services, volunteers who are available 24/7, and even those in themselves, whilst not qualified counsellors. It's so nice to have a conversation with someone who goes, yeah, that sounds pretty shit. Like, tell me about it. Like, just vent on me. I don't know you. I'm not going to tell anyone else. So go for it. And it's so beneficial. So
everybody needs somebody to talk to, even if it's just a listening ear. You don't have to provide advice. I mean, no one's expecting you to be a therapist, but just to sit with someone. I mean, how many times have you sat out with a coworker out back on a stoop somewhere, or maybe behind the bar when you guys were closed, and just talked, just connected? Everybody needs that. It doesn't matter what industry you're in or what you're going through. Everybody needs somebody to talk to.
So true. Yeah, that sense of community is especially in a digital world, which in digital technology can be used for good. But I do think that we naturally become a little bit lazy and a little bit more conditioned to, everyone else has got their shit together online, so I'm just going to have to deal with my shit in my own personal time. And it doesn't often work.
Well, the social media sphere only shows you what they want you to see. And you have to realize that everybody's going through something. Whether or not they're talking about it, everybody's going through something. And you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to do the work. You got to do the emotional work to get stronger and more resilient, and to understand that the world is not only what you see in pictures on the internet. It's bigger than that.
It is, yeah. I was chatting to a chap he was in the hotel in Atlanta. His name was Andrew, and he was barkeep, and he said to me, right, I am giving up hospitality. I said, why? He goes, oh, long hours, etc. I said, what are you doing instead? He goes, I'm a pianist, and I teach people piano online. And this little video, that sounds very degrading. This little enterprise that he'd started, full of videos and content on education and resources, etc. And I was saying to him, why leave hospitality though? Why not keep up? And he was like, well, there isn't much opportunity in Atlanta. And I said, ever been to the UK or Europe? He was like, no, man, I've never left the southern states of America. And I was telling him about all the opportunities and the different cuisines and all this sort of stuff. And his mind was blown. He was like, I'm homeschooled. I've never left this area. And so I think, similarly to that point, encourage curiosity. Get outside of those circles, start to learn more, develop more, meet more people, have new experiences. Because, my God, the world is such a big place. There's so much out there.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the good things about the internet, is that you have access to a wealth of knowledge and education. The Burnt Chef Academy is a great access resource for mental health support and hospitality. Even just having that as a resource was fantastic. And then that kind of encouraged me to pursue learning more about resources in other states and education in other states. So just be open to learning new things. That will help you grow as a person, as a chef, as an individual, in any industry, no matter what you're doing. Just keep learning new things.
It was so good. And again, I was going to ask you during this conversation, actually, where did all your knowledge come from? Because I'm looking at your ideas and the posts that you put out on social media, and they're so coherent and well formed. Like, I look at those and go, I respect that, but that's quite an intrinsic and quite an in-depth views formed on very progressive views formed as well. I respect it. So where did you learn all of that from?
It sounds weird. A lot of it is just, I'll be watching something and I'll be thinking, how can we utilize this? What ways can we utilize this technology? So for instance, AI. I think AI has so much potential in hospitality, but also in things like senior living. What are things that we can use AI for to help our residents? So it could be things like helping regulate a schedule, helping regulate things like if they like a particular menu item, helping keep track of the things that they like to incorporate when we're creating menus for specific groups of people. I mean, there's so many things that I think people don't really take into account with things like AI. And I'm just thinking, how can this benefit us some way? And I think about that with whatever I'm watching, whether it might be a story on whether it's AI or a story about, mental health resources or farming or sustainability. I keep thinking about, well, how is that something that I can utilize? And I just come up with ideas. How can this help us? How can this help me? And how can this help other people? It really stems from, how can this help other people, and how can we make the world a little bit better?
It's amazing. I love it. Keep going as well. Keep being inspired by different content. And again, pulling it in, making it relevant to the audiences that you serve.
Thank you.
So I've got another 100 questions for you, but I'm also conscious that already we're over the hour, the limit that my team have set me, because they know what I'm like. And once I start talking to someone I enjoy speaking to, we go on for a long time. So to wrap this up to a healthy close, where do you see the future of mental health or positive workplace culture over the next 10 years?
I would love to get us to a point where we can have open conversations. I think we're on our way there. I think it's just going to take a little bit more pressure. I think it's going to be a little bit more people coming out of their shells, coming out of their comfort zone, and talking about things that make them uncomfortable and having those tough conversations. And I would love to see us have more places to go. So like in-person support groups. I think the online sphere is great. That's been a big helpful tool. But I would love us to have actual places that we can go, whether it's hospitality or anything really, but actual physical spaces where we can go and do things like maybe culinary therapy, or we can have special exercises dedicated to people who are on their feet all the time or who work with their hands all the time. Special exercise therapy classes, things like of that nature, an actual building that you can go to, and having them all over the place where people can just go and connect and understand that they're not the only ones with these problems. And then once they realize that the conversation becomes so much easier. You don't have to be afraid of saying, I've been dealing with chronic carpal tunnel because I've been cooking for 20 years, or I've been typing for 20 years, or, my back hurts because I've been carrying huge trays for 20 years, or even 5 years. I mean, just having that space to connect with people would make a huge difference. And I would love to see more physical spaces for people to meet and connect like that. And I think we'll get that with time.
I believe so. I fully believe it. What a great idea. I could listen to you for ages. I really could.
You're so sweet.
No, I'm not even being sweet. I'm being genuine. Like when you meet someone who has just got it and they understand it and they've got a pragmatic view and understanding that change isn't the next year, which can also sound really, really bad. And I appreciate it for those who are looking for a quick fix right now. Change is there and there are small tweaks that you can make, but understand those tweaks compound. But ultimately, it's going to take time from an industry perspective. It's actually really nice. It's really refreshing. It makes me feel seen and not alone in this work.
No, not at all. I mean, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We work together and we find people with like goals, and we find out how our goals intersect, and then we can work on those goals together. That's how we make change.
Indeed. And so as a final parting, the question I always ask my guests is, if you would travel back in time to that young 17, 18-year-old hospitality professional and impart some words of wisdom, what would you tell yourself?
I would tell her not to put all of her eggs in one basket. I would tell her to branch out a little bit. At that point, I thought that I would have had that job for the rest of my life. I really did. I thought I was going to work there for the rest of my life and retire from there. And that was just the company culture that we had. And I wish I had dedicated more time to developing more skills. I mean, that's something I'm doing now, and I'm proud of myself for doing that. And a part of me wishes I had started doing that a little sooner, but just to recognize that there are opportunities everywhere you go. You just have to know how to frame it and how to be acceptable to learning something new. You have to be open to learning it and to seeing what you can actually take away from the experiences that you have.
Thank you. And as we have just opened up, this is the last question, I promise you. As we have opened up applications for our ambassador scheme for 2025, what would you say to someone who was thinking about becoming an ambassador, but just didn't know? Like, what's your involvement look like, and what encouragement would you give them?
I would say do it. Please do it, because it's one of the most rewarding things that I have done recently, because I am so passionate about what I do. I love to cook and I love the people that I work with. And having the ability to be a voice in a space where people don't feel comfortable talking right now. I still have coworkers that don't want to talk about this. They think that they have no voice, that things aren't going to change. And unfortunately, that's the perception right now. But the more voices that we have, the better that it's going to be. And if you want to help drive change, this is the way to do it. We have a like-minded group of people who will support you and listen to you, and to be involved in, really cool events, things like, the burnt brunches and the events at Atlanta. To have that space to connect with people is so invaluable. It's something that we need. And please, if you have any interest, just please reach out, please apply. And we need those strong voices right now. We need more people who want to make better changes.
Thank you, Nio. And in terms of where can people find you? When can people find out more information about your nonprofit as well? What's the best way of learning more?
you can visit our website. Our organization's called Serving Up Support Maine, but we're not exclusive to Maine. We're collecting resources all throughout New England, and eventually we'd like to go across the nation and eventually the globe, but we'll start in here in New England. And the website is www.servingupsupportmaine.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. We have an Instagram page for our organization. It's at Serving Up Support Maine. We would love to talk to you if you're struggling with anything. If you need help finding resources, please don't hesitate to reach out. And, reach out to the Burnt Chef Project as well. They have that employee assistance program. It's fantastic. I've actually had people who've called into it and they said it was wonderful. So please reach out. Don't be silent anymore. Don't struggle alone. It's not worth it.
Nio, thank you ever so much. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Chris. It means a lot to speak to you today, and I really appreciate that. So thank you for everything.
You're welcome. Thank you.